Welcome back to Hope Tales. Today's story is about an 11-year-old girl who faced the impossible, stood inside the cockpit of a Boeing 372, and made a choice that saved every soul on board. Sarah was 11, small, quiet and always. The kind of child who blended into the background rather than stood in the spotlight. She wasn't the loudest in class, the bravest on the playground, or the kind of girl who chased adventure. But she had something else. Something no one noticed until it mattered. A calmness, a way of watching the world quietly, absorbing details without ever drawing attention. On the morning of the flight, Sarah sat by the window seat of a Boeing 737, her legs barely touching the floor, her backpack hugging her feet. The aircraft hummed with the normal life of passengers settling in. Businessmen opening laptops, families arranging bags, tourists taking photos, and flight attendants performing the routine checks they'd done 1,000 times. Outside the window, the sun washed the runway in warm gold as ground vehicles moved smoothly around the plane. Everything looked peaceful, too peaceful to hint at the storm that waited ahead. Sarah's mother sat beside her, relaxed, gently scrolling through her phone. For them, this was supposed to be a simple flight home after visiting relatives. Nothing unusual, nothing remarkable. The engines roared to life with that familiar deep rumble, vibrating softly through the cabin. Sarah watched the wing flex as the aircraft began its slow taxi, feeling that quiet excitement children feel during takeoff, the sense of flying, of rising above the world. The Boeing 737 lifted smoothly into the sky, climbing through soft clouds as the city shrank below. It was calm, the kind of flight passengers barely remember later. Seatbelt signs switched off, people leaned back, and the typical soundtrack of a routine. Flight filled the cabin, the muted hum of engines, low conversations, and occasional beeps from the galley. Sarah pulled out her small notebook and began sketching the wing. She always drew during flights. Something about airplanes interested her, not in a dramatic, aviation geek way, but in a quiet fascination. She liked watching how the ailerons moved, how the flaps retracted, how the sunlight danced on the engine cowling. Even then, she never imagined she would one day touch those controls, or that hundreds of lives would depend on her. 40 minutes into the flight, the aircraft cruised at 34,000 feet, slicing through calm skies. Nothing unusual happened, not yet. Even the crew in the cockpit chatted comfortably as the autopilot held the course. But deep inside the systems, inside the mechanical veins of the Boeing 737, something small began to fail. A hairline crack, invisible to the eye, weakened a critical hydraulic component. At first it was nothing. The aircraft continued its smooth cruise, and no warning appeared. But pressure inside the line increased, vibration continued, and altitude placed more strain on the already compromised system. Then something shifted. A faint tremor ran through the plane, so light that most passengers didn't notice. But Sarah felt it. She pressed her hand to the window, sensing the slight change in vibration. She couldn't explain it, but it felt different. She glanced at the wing again. Nothing looked wrong, but the air around her felt heavier now, as if something unseen had entered the cabin. In the cockpit, the first warning blinked. A pressure imbalance, a simple caution message. The kind pilots see and fix quickly. The captain checked the instruments. Nothing alarming, but not normal either. Moments later, a second warning appeared. Then a third. Then the alarm. Sarah didn't hear the alarms, but she felt the shift in the aircraft's behavior. The Boeing 737, once steady as a rock, began to sway gently, correcting itself every few seconds. The flight attendants paused in the aisle, sensing something was off. Suddenly, a soft jolt ran through the cabin, and this time, everyone felt it. Passengers looked up. A baby cried. A man tightened his seatbelt. The flight attendants exchanged quick, tight glances. The aircraft banked slightly, then straightened. Nothing dramatic, but just enough to raise questions. Sarah closed her notebook and pressed her back against the seat. She wasn't scared, not yet, but she felt a strange pressure in her chest, as if the air had turned thick. Inside the cockpit, everything escalated fast. The hydraulic system feeding the primary controls was failing. Warnings flashed in rapid succession. Autopilot disengaged. The aircraft drifted slightly off course. The pilots wrestled with controls that suddenly felt heavier, less responsive. The captain tried to stabilize the aircraft manually, applying corrections to maintain altitude. But then the impossible happened. A loud, grinding sound echoed through the fuselage. It was followed by a deep vibration that shook the entire cabin. Sarah grabbed the armrests, eyes wide. This wasn't turbulence. This was something different, something mechanical. Passengers murmured nervously. The flight attendants moved quickly, securing carts and bracing themselves. Then came the sharp drop. The aircraft dipped, losing altitude for several seconds before leveling again. People gasped. Bags shifted. Someone screamed softly. Panic buzzed in the air like electricity. Sarah's heart pounded, but her eyes remained glued to the wing. She noticed it again. The movement wasn't normal. The flaps trembled like they were fighting against something. In the cockpit, the pilots struggled. They pushed the throttles forward, trying to climb, but the controls fought back. The hydraulic system responsible for stabilizing the aircraft had suffered catastrophic failure. Only backup systems remained, but even those began to flicker with warnings. Another sharp vibration shook the aircraft. Passengers gripped their seats, breathing in short, panicked bursts. Sarah's mother placed a hand on her shoulder, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was racing, not with fear, but with observation. She was watching something she didn't completely understand yet, but something inside her recognized the seriousness. Then the lights flickered. Not enough to go out fully, but enough to cause a ripple of fear through the cabin. The engines remained steady, but the aircraft didn't feel steady anymore. It felt unpredictable. The captain attempted another correction, but the Boeing 737 drifted slightly left. The aircraft simply wasn't listening like before. Something was failing, and failing fast. Passengers looked around as if waiting for an announcement that never came. The silence was worse than any words. Sarah inhaled deeply, clutching her notebook. Her sketch of the wing stared back at her, incomplete. She had drawn it perfectly, clean, stable, functional. But the real wing outside was trembling with stress. The real aircraft was beginning to lose the one thing every passenger trusted blindly: control. And far ahead, unseen beyond the cockpit door, the situation was spiraling into something no one on board had ever imagined possible. The moment that would change Sarah's life forever was approaching. The flight was no longer stable, no longer routine, no longer safe, and the pilots were running out of time. Sarah's world had changed in an instant. The Boeing 372, once smooth and predictable, now shuddered violently. Every vibration a reminder that the aircraft was fighting against forces it was never meant to endure. Alarms blared across the cockpit, bright reds and flashing lights. But her eyes focused on the small details, the subtle movements of the controls, the trembling wings outside the window. She had watched planes her entire life from the safety of her seat. But now she was part of the flight, part of the emergency, part of the miracle that had yet to happen. The pilots were struggling with the failing systems. Engine 1 had begun to overheat. Engine 2 was completely offline. Hydraulic systems were compromised, leaving critical control surfaces sluggish and unresponsive. Autopilot had disengaged in panic, and the aircraft was drifting slightly to the left. Every correction the crew attempted seemed to only partially succeed. The 737 groaned under stress as though protesting every movement. Passengers began to sense the severity of the situation. The gentle hum of conversation had turned into quiet murmurs, uneasy shuffling, and wide-eyed stares at the wings that seemed to twitch unnaturally. A soft metallic creak echoed across the fuselage as the weakened left wing flexed beyond its normal limits. Bags shifted in the overhead compartments, and the emergency lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across the cabin. Flight attendants moved quickly to reassure passengers, but even their calm faces reflected the tension in the air. Sarah remained still in her seat, her small hands gripping the armrest as she absorbed every detail. Her eyes traced the lines of the wing visible through the window. She saw the subtle tremor in the ailerons, the flicker of sunlight on the engine casing, the way the plane rocked slightly with every gust of wind. Her mind, sharp beyond her years, began to form patterns in what she observed. She noticed how the yoke moved in the pilot's hands in response to the plane's shifts. She noticed the throttle adjustments that corrected minor dips, and in that instant, a realization struck her: she could help. She had watched and learned enough to know that small, careful inputs could make a difference. The captain called out procedures. running through emergency checklists at lightning speed. Every warning light triggered another decision. The crew rerouted hydraulics through alternate systems, attempting to regain control of surfaces like the flaps and rudder. Every lever pulled, every button pressed, was a battle against time and gravity. The aircraft, loaded with more than 150 passengers and heavy fuel tanks, had become a massive test of skill, endurance, and composure. The turbulence added another layer of danger. Clouds outside churned as the Boeing 372 fought to stay level. Passengers began to panic quietly. Some prayed, some held children tightly, some simply stared out the windows, unable to comprehend the danger. Flight attendants moved with quiet authority, holding calm for the passengers even while their own nerves threatened to betray them. The smell of ozone and overheated machinery crept into the cabin as smoke faintly wafted from the compromised engine, adding to the tension. The cockpit was a controlled chaos. Every system had warnings. Hydraulic pressure low, engine temperature high, flaps malfunctioning, autopilot offline. The pilots were issuing instructions rapidly, coordinating emergency systems while maintaining awareness of altitude, speed, and heading. Every decision was critical. Every second mattered. A minor error could push the aircraft into an unrecoverable dive. Sarah, small and unnoticed, remained a keen observer. She noticed how the captain's hands moved along the yoke to correct minor banking, how gentle throttle adjustments countered unexpected drops. She noted the sequence in which the pilots pressed buttons, the way they compensated for system failures. A plan began forming in her mind, a tentative strategy born from observation, intuition, and the calm clarity that only an 11-year-old child untouched by fear could hold. The aircraft began a slow descent as the pilots prepared for emergency procedures. The engines, weakened and stressed, struggled to maintain altitude. Fuel imbalance threatened to tilt the plane, making smooth control nearly impossible. Yet the pilots remained steady, eyes scanning instruments, hands moving with precision honed from years of experience. Sarah's mother gripped her hand tightly, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. She did not fully understand what, but instinctively, she realized that Sarah's attention was unbroken, focused in a way that defied the terror around them. The realization that Sarah had absorbed more than just casual observation, she had internalized patterns, movements, and procedures, was subtle but critical. The cabin lights flickered again, adding urgency to the moment. Outside, the dark clouds formed a foreboding ceiling, lightning flashing faintly in the distance. Visibility would soon become limited if they did not act quickly. Every instrument in the cockpit was a potential lifesaver, and every control input now carried the weight of hundreds of lives. The pilots coordinated, moving through emergency checklists with the precision of surgeons. But it was clear that some systems were beyond repair. Manual override was now the only option. It demanded steady hands, clear thinking, and flawless timing. The aircraft's weight, speed, and damaged control surfaces created a delicate balance. Too much force on the yoke and the wing could fail. Too little and they risked a stall. Sarah's observations had sharpened her awareness. She noted the sequence of stabilizing movements and the timing required. Her mind worked rapidly, correlating each vibration, each engine sound, with the appropriate corrective action. She had not touched the controls yet, but she was mentally rehearsing the procedure, preparing for the moment when she might need to act. Meanwhile, the Boeing 372 responded to subtle pilot inputs with unpredictable behavior. The damaged engine produced uneven thrust, causing slight yaw. The remaining systems strained under the weight of the aircraft and its occupants. Cabin lights dimmed and flickered again. Every small correction in the cockpit seemed amplified throughout the plane, reminding all on board of how delicate the balance had become. The aircraft began a slow, controlled turn toward the nearest safe airport. The wind buffet increased. Rain streaked the windows. Passengers clutched armrests, some closing their eyes, others staring at the distant horizon. Flight attendants moved strategically, ensuring that the aisles remained clear and that passengers remained as calm as possible. Sarah's mind continued to work. She had no formal training, but the combination of her prior observation, instinct, and intense focus allowed her to anticipate what the pilots might need next. Every movement of the yoke, every throttle adjustment, every corrective action was a lesson she had absorbed in minutes, honed by necessity and sharpened by instinct. The stage was set. The aircraft was damaged, the pilots stretched to their limits, and the passengers unaware of just how close they were to disaster. The emergency was escalating. Every second counted, and soon, Sarah's quiet observation, patience and courage would be called into action in a way no child and no adult had ever imagined. The Boeing 372 shuddered violently as the damage from the failing engines and compromised systems spread throughout the aircraft. Every vibration, every creak of the metal, reminded everyone on board that this was no ordinary flight. The cabin lights flickered, casting a trembling glow across anxious faces. Passengers gripped armrests and tightened seatbelts, staring out windows at the clouds racing by in unnatural patterns. The subtle rocking of the plane was no longer gentle turbulence. It was the aircraft pleading for control. In the cockpit, the pilots were at the brink. Hydraulic systems were failing, engine thrust was uneven, and instrument panels were flashing warnings faster than they could process. The yokes felt heavy and unresponsive. Autopilot had long since disengaged, leaving only human skill and instinct to keep the massive aircraft aloft. Every movement of the controls had to be deliberate and measured. One wrong adjustment could push the 737 into an unrecoverable dive. Sarah's eyes remained wide but calm. She had watched everything in the past. Tense minutes, the slight pressure applied to the yoke, the timing of throttle adjustments, the subtle corrections made to stabilize the plane's roll. Her mind had absorbed it all, linking every visual cue with potential corrective action. She realized in a way that no one else on board could yet grasp that she could contribute. A sudden jolt sent a tray clattering in the cabin. A sharp vibration raced up the fuselage. The plane had dipped slightly, rolling to the left as the left engine sputtered. The captain's hands flew over the controls, but even he struggled to maintain equilibrium. The co-pilot's eyes darted between gauges, noting the rapidly changing altitude and heading. That was the moment. Sarah moved quietly toward the cockpit door, unseen by the passengers and barely noticed by the crew. Her mother's hand gripped hers tightly, but Sarah had already made up her mind. She stepped inside, taking in the cockpit's chaos, the flashing lights, the red alerts, the slight smoke trailing from an overheated system. She approached the throttle quadrant and the yoke carefully, her small hands hovering over the controls as she remembered every movement she had observed. The pilots froze for a moment, aware of her presence. They understood instantly that she was not panicking. She was focused, deliberate, calm. Something inside them shifted, an inexplicable trust, born of necessity that this child could help. They began to guide her, pointing subtly to which controls could be adjusted safely. Sarah's first inputs were minimal. She pushed the yoke gently, watching the wingtip respond in slight increments. The aircraft shuddered, then leveled. Encouraged, she adjusted the throttle for engine 3, compensating for the failing engine 2. The plane responded with subtle correction, the roll stabilizing slightly. She adjusted again, her motions deliberate, mirroring the precise movements she had observed from the pilots. The passengers, unaware of the child at the controls, continued to feel the subtle shifts in the aircraft. Many clutched their seats, unaware that someone so young had become the lifeline between disaster and survival. Flight attendants moved carefully through the aisles, securing loose items and maintaining calm, instinctively recognizing that panic now could make any minor turbulence catastrophic. Outside, clouds thickened, casting a muted gray across the fuselage. Sunlight streaked through occasional breaks, creating a dramatic interplay of shadows and light across the wings. Sarah adjusted the yoke slightly, feeling the subtle feedback through the controls, learning the aircraft's response in real time. The Boeing 372, wounded yet resilient, seemed to respond to her care. The pilots guided her verbally, instructing her on gentle throttle, adjustments, and minimal corrections to the control surfaces. Each instruction was a lesson, and Sarah absorbed it instantly. Her small hands moved with precision, her mind calculating angles, thrust, and stabilization instinctively. Each successful input brought the aircraft closer to equilibrium, each adjustment a small miracle of observation, courage, and clarity. Time became a fluid concept. Seconds stretched into long minutes as Sarah maintained control with the guidance of the pilots. Every minor correction prevented a cascade of failures from turning into catastrophe. The plane leveled, climbed slightly, then glided steadily. Passengers felt it. The turbulence lessened, the vibration muted. Hope returned slowly, subtly, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Yet danger remained. The left engine continued to sputter. Hydraulic systems remained partially compromised, and warning lights flashed intermittently. Each correction required careful thought. Sarah learned to anticipate the plane's reactions. A slight downward push when the wing dipped. A minute throttle adjustment to maintain altitude. Her mind had become a living flight computer. Responding instinctively to an emergency, no simulation could replicate. The crew coordinated with air traffic control, requesting immediate clearance for the nearest airport. The voice crackled over the radio, confirming an emergency landing procedure. The pilots guided Sarah, explaining the sequence. Approach, descent, flaps, landing gear, all while keeping the aircraft stable. She memorized each step, adjusting the yoke and throttles as instructed. The approach began. The runway in the distance was a thin, pale line against the green landscape below. The Boeing 372, heavily damaged, still bore the weight of hundreds of lives. Its wings flexed under stress, engines strained against gravity. But Sarah maintained gentle control, keeping it aligned with the approach path. The landing gear deployed, though one wheel locked slowly. Sarah's hands adjusted the controls subtly, compensating for uneven deployment. The aircraft shuddered but remained on the correct path. Passengers looked out, seeing the runway approach in tense anticipation, unaware of the incredible child guiding the plane from behind the cockpit seats. Final descent required delicate precision. Sarah coordinated throttle and yoke adjustments, maintaining the correct glide slope. The plane trembled under stress, but her focus never wavered. The pilot's guidance was minimal now. Sarah's instincts and observation had become sufficient to maintain control. The Boeing 372 descended steadily, wings flexing but stable, engines responding to gentle throttle inputs. Passengers gripped their seats, sensing that this was no ordinary landing. The tension in the cabin was nearly tangible, a quiet mix of fear, anticipation, and the faint sense that something extraordinary was occurring. In those critical moments, Sarah's calm and focus became the axis upon which survival turned. Every subtle movement, every measured input, kept the aircraft aligned with the runway. Every passing second brought the plane closer to safety. The impossible was becoming real. An 11-year-old child was guiding a Boeing 372 to a landing that should have been beyond any child's capability, and the world below waited, unaware of the hero controlling the aircraft above. The runway stretched before them like a thin lifeline, pale against the fading green of fields and scattered buildings. Sarah's hands were small but steady on the controls, guided by instinct, observation, and the faint instructions of the pilots who had begun to step back, letting her take the lead. Every vibration of the Boeing 372 vibrated through the fuselage, every tremor a reminder of how fragile the situation remained. Yet despite the damaged left wing, compromised engines, and flickering warning lights, the plane was moving with an eerie sense of purpose, toward survival. The passengers were unaware of the child now controlling their fate. They could feel the subtle changes in the aircraft's stability, sense the smoother glide, but they did not know that it was Sarah's small hands that had brought the Boeing 372 under equilibrium. Flight attendants moved strategically through the cabin, keeping calm, directing passengers to maintain their positions, their training and composure, complementing the extraordinary control being applied in the cockpit. Outside, the clouds parted intermittently, streaks of sunlight illuminating the wings and fuselage. The runway grew larger, its lines crisp and precise in Sarah's eyes. The emergency lights in the cockpit reflected off the windows, contrasting with the natural light outside. The engines groaned unevenly, producing vibrations that Sarah instinctively compensated for by tiny adjustments on the throttle quadrant and yoke. Each input was measured, deliberate, and perfectly timed, a dance she had never imagined performing. Yet she executed flawlessly. The pilots watched silently, awe replacing tension. The emergency checklists had been completed. Backup systems were engaged. All that remained was the landing, a feat no simulator could replicate. No training fully prepared one to handle. And yet, in the hands of a quiet, determined 11-year-old, the impossible was beginning to feel achievable. The descent continued. The airspeed was slightly higher than usual for a landing, necessary to compensate for the uneven thrust and partially damaged wing. Sarah's eyes scanned the instruments and the horizon simultaneously. She adjusted flaps cautiously, slowing the aircraft without risking a stall. The landing gear lights blinked, confirming partial deployment. She compensated for the slightly delayed wheel on the left side, gently tilting the aircraft to maintain perfect alignment with the runway. The first bumps of the landing gear touching tarmac sent vibrations through the fuselage. Tires screeched slightly against the runway, and smoke rose faintly from friction. Passengers felt the sudden jolt, gripping armrests instinctively. Flight attendants held steady, signaling calm, while the pilots monitored Sarah's precision, prepared to intervene if needed. Sarah's small hands moved with astonishing confidence. She adjusted throttle and yoke, keeping the Boeing 372 aligned perfectly despite the uneven braking and gusts of wind across the runway. Each vibration, each resistance from the damaged left wing was compensated for, her reactions nearly instantaneous. The aircraft shuddered, rolled slightly, then stabilized. Time seemed to stretch as the plane traveled down the runway. The remaining distance felt endless. The engines struggled under weight and friction, flaring with uneven bursts of thrust. Sarah's focus never wavered. Every adjustment she made prevented a potential disaster. The runway grew longer, stretching toward safety. Outside, emergency crews were ready, foam and fire suppression at the ready, but their presence was precautionary. The miracle unfolding inside the cockpit was the true lifeline. Passengers began to relax slightly, some sensing that the turbulence was decreasing, the plane leveling. Children clutched toys, adults gripped hands, but an underlying sense of hope began to permeate the cabin. None of them could see Sarah at work, yet the calm was palpable. The Boeing 372 slowed gradually under Sarah's guidance. Reverse thrust was applied carefully, compensating for uneven engine performance. The left wing remained slightly flexed, showing scars from the earlier stress, yet it held firm. Sarah coordinated flaps and rudder adjustments precisely, keeping the plane centered, perfectly aligned with the runway's middle line. Finally, the aircraft came to a complete stop. Silence replaced the vibrations, the alarms, and the fear. The Boeing 372, heavily damaged yet intact, had landed safely. A collective breath seemed to escape from the cabin in unison. Passengers looked around, realizing they were alive, safe, and unharmed. Flight attendants allowed smiles, tears, and gentle relief to surface. In the cockpit, the pilot stepped forward and embraced Sarah quietly, not needing words. Their awe and gratitude were palpable. They had guided her, yes, but it was her observation, focus, and composure under pressure that had turned a catastrophic emergency into a safe landing. The world outside was beginning to notice, too. Emergency crews approached cautiously, but there were no fires, no casualties, no explosion. The plane was a wounded survivor, and the hero behind the miracle was an 11-year-old child. News of the landing spread like wildfire. Media outlets captured images of the plane, of the calm, composed child now celebrated worldwide. Aviation experts analyzed the flight, marveling at the combination of factors: the damage, the malfunctioning engines, the failing hydraulic systems, and concluded that this landing defied every expectation. An 11-year-old, guided by instinct and observation, had succeeded where trained professionals could only hope. For Sarah, the moment was quiet. She had acted, observed, and focused, and now the plane rested safely before her. She stepped out into the sunlight, blinking at the bright sky, surrounded by passengers, crew, and emergency personnel. The world cheered, celebrated, and marveled at her courage. But for Sarah, it was simply a moment of clarity, focus, and responsibility fulfilled. The Boeing 372 would forever bear the marks of this impossible journey. Its scars were a testament to human resilience, extraordinary courage, and a miracle born not from chance, but from quiet observation, calm decision-making, and the bravery of a child who stepped up when the world needed her most. This flight would be remembered not just as a story of survival, but as a story of hope. The hope that even in the most impossible circumstances, courage, focus, and determination can create miracles. Sarah, 11 years old, had shown the world that heroes can come from the most unexpected places, and that even a child can carry the weight of hundreds of lives and land them safely.